Hey everyone, back with our last lecture video of the semester on the Southeast Asia realm, and I'm going to try to get this going here and get through this relatively quickly. So we've already studied the South Asian realm, and we have studied the East Asian realm. Now we're going to study the Southeast Asian realm. Now, this is a relatively small realm with regards to land area, but pretty high in population. It is mostly a rainforest slash humid environment, meaning that there's not a lot of really dry areas. There are a couple there. We have some rain shadow effect up in the Myanmar Burma area up here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But on the most part, you're talking about a lot of rainforest on these islands and some temperate, humid type climates up in these areas. There are also tropical areas on the southern peninsula here in Vietnam and these areas. So again, just orienting yourself, this is China right here. Japan will be up in this area. Taiwan is right here. So this is East Asia, and just over here the corner, this is India, and if you remember, Bangladesh is right here. So this is the South Asian realm. So we're right between the two major Asian realms, kind of down the corner in the Southeast Asian realm. And you see a whole lot of islands in this realm. So this is just kind of a general summary. Most of these countries are going to be smaller than some of the ones we've been studying, especially India and China. You might hear the term Indochina sometimes for this area. That's really not an accurate name, but it was a name that was used by the French back in the colonial times to describe this area, because naturally it's kind of in between India and China, thus you have Indochina. And you have cultural influences from both China and India, although I think China in today's world has really dominated that. You're going to see some Indian influences in the far western part of the realm, but more Chinese in the rest of the realm. There have been impacts in this realm. You see the Cold War there. Think about the Vietnam War. Most of you are a little bit younger. I was not privy to being around to experience the Vietnam War, but it was just before my time, so it was still in like the news, and we learned about that a lot when I was younger. The Japanese culture and the country has had a huge impact in this area, especially in World War II. The Japanese pretty much controlled all of this area for a time. And then we've had a hand in the area as we have had across the entire world. There's a lot of cultural diversity in this area. And you can see here ethnicity, language, religion, food, everything. There's a lot of small individual enclaves and cultures within this realm. And some of these countries are kind of nervous about China and their growing superpower status. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the entire PowerPoint here. It's going to be a primary topic of discussion as we go through this. So again, this is a realm of islands and peninsulas. You have a big peninsula right up here. Then you've got all these islands and archipelago. Remember, an archipelago is kind of a chain of islands. And that kind of fills up this water body. You have the South China Sea right here, the Pacific Ocean out here, the Indian Ocean down here to the west and southwest, and this is Australia right here. So that gives you a little bit of understanding where we're talking about on the globe. We're between the two Asian realms and Australia. So Indonesia is the biggest country, both land area and population in the realm. In Indonesia, you see in big letters right here across here, it's a series of islands. They have these islands. You have over here, I'm sorry. Then you have the southern part of Borneo and all the way to Papua New Guinea out here. So Indonesia is the biggest country, and I think it's the fourth largest in the world by population. They do a lot of commerce, primarily with China. They do some with India and a lot of the Southwest Asian part, the Arabian area, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states over there in that general area. The Philippines once was an American colony. It was also once a Spanish colony. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And let me see. I'm just reading through here to see what I want to mention. We've mentioned the Ring of Fire several times in our class, both for the South American realm and the North American realm. Out here in the Pacific, if you remember, that's a big plate, and around the edge of it you have a lot of volcanoes and earthquakes. You see here the tsunami. So that kind of dominates especially the eastern part of this realm, but it also gets into these countries as well. Now Borneo is an exception. Borneo is the least likely island to have any volcanic or earthquake activity. And the reason for that, it's a geological thing, but basically Borneo is kind of a remnant of an ancient continent. So it kind of has its own little plate here. I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but it sits pretty stable with regards to the other ones that are on the plate boundaries that move around all the time. So Borneo is kind of unique for this general area. That and the mainland as well. It's not too bad up here on the mainland either, but all these islands generally have a lot of earthquakes and some volcanic activity. Tsunamis are not common, but they occur here as much as anywhere in the world. Tsunamis, if you don't know, is a seismic sea wave, which means we used to call it back in the old days a tidal wave that gets really big because water is displaced by either an earthquake or a volcano. And there was a really big one in 2004 in Indonesia. And if you haven't ever seen a video of that, some of you are probably too young to remember it very much. You can look it up on YouTube. It's unbelievable the devastation that it caused. And we had enough cameras around back then that it was actually in some areas captured on camera. And it's pretty spooky the way the ocean can just rise up and just inundate places that aren't normally like that. So there have been some catastrophic volcanic eruptions historically in this area as well. Krakatoa was the most popular back in 1883, but in 1815, which is a very long time ago, you had the Tambora volcano. So back in those days, of course, there weren't as many people around as there would be today because the population just wasn't as big. But the big thing about it was it put so much ash into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun enough that they call it the year without a summer. We can tell by historical records that were taken at the time and by geological studies on ice cores and stuff like that, that we went without a summer almost that year, that entire year. It was cool to cold during the summer months because the sun was simply blocked out. So it had a great effect on the entire world. So that it was that big of a volcanic eruption. And this area is pretty mountainous in general, all these islands, because they have a history as being volcanic. And even up here on the peninsula is near some plate boundaries as well, like the Indian subcontinent when it crashed into Asia back in the day. So there's a lot of mountains. Even though these are islands, they have pretty high relief or pretty high altitude for being such a mountainous area or such an island area. So I did want to jump out of this really quickly and just go back over here to my So this is in your lesson for this chapter, and this is a map of the elevation. You see up here the green represents lower elevations, and as you go yellow and then eventually red, it shows higher elevations. And you see all of these islands have basically a spine or areas that have higher elevations on them, pretty high mountains or volcanoes. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of what we're looking at with regards to the terrain there. So let's jump back into this. So again, it's mentioned this is about Borneo. I've already mentioned Borneo. That's this island right here. It actually contains two different countries. Two countries split this. The northern part of it is Malaysia. The southern part is Indonesia. But the island itself, again, they call it a mini continent because of its relative stability and its geologic history being part of a remnant continent, a paleo continent, if you will. And this is kind of the story of that. You can read this in your textbook. It talks about the rainforest here. A lot of biological diversity in this realm. Again, these islands, first of all, they have a rainforest, which is always biologically active. But also, you have some unique situations here where these islands, of course, are split by the ocean. So you've got some different examples of evolution that's occurred with the wildlife that's kind of separated from each other on these different islands. So they have pretty unique environments there. Unfortunately, just like everywhere else in the world, as our population grows, people are encroaching on that biodiversity on a daily basis. They're cutting the rainforest. So loss of habitat is a big issue there. And the big culprit in this area now, it's just like anywhere else. People want to farm, they want to develop, they want to grow their food. So that's the driving force, and log and get money for the wood. That's the driving force behind this. But the primary type of agriculture in this region is called palm oil plantations. Palm oil is something that you probably don't hear about a lot in your everyday lives because we don't really use it in its raw form as palm oil. But palm oil is in a whole lot of processed foods that we eat. You don't realize it, but if you read ingredients on a lot of different foods, it'll have palm oil in there. So that's what's really being hard on the rainforest environment there. So let me see what I want to go over on this slide. I've already kind of mentioned the animal species, the biodiversity. So there's a lot of unique spices in this area as well. And that kind of goes all the way toward India over here. The mainland, the islands, toward India. And if you remember in your history classes from high school, we always talked about Christopher Columbus was trying to find a route around the other side of the globe as a shortcut to get to the India area of the spices. And now they call it the Indian area, but they're also talking about this area as well. A lot of spices came from this area, and a lot of our colonial activity here, the European colonial activity, was to get these spices. The spice trade was huge back in those days in colonial times, and that was a big proponent here in this specific realm. So again, this realm in general has a lot of precipitation, a lot of rainfall, and the distribution of population reflects the relationship between the rivers and the people. So that means more people are going to be located. You're going to have higher population densities along rivers, and especially at river deltas where the river empties into the ocean. Those are going to be your biggest cities located near these deltas. And here are the four primary rivers, and these are gone over in your textbook. I'll mention, we're going to talk about the Mekong here in just a little bit. The Mekong River, if you studied the Vietnam War history, you've heard of the Mekong Delta. It's right down here in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is a elongated country. It starts up here, goes around the coast, and goes all the way to the southern tip of this peninsula down here. So most of the Mekong River is not in Vietnam. However, the delta is. So you hear a lot of stories, if you study the Vietnam War, about fighting on the Mekong because there was riverboats and there was a lot of activity in that area. So the headwaters of this river is up here in China, in the Tibetan highlands of China. And that's kind of important because, as you see on this map here, the last lesson we had on East Asia, we talked about China and their constant need to increase their resources because of their growing population. So this map, this all in green is the Mekong River watershed. So all this water that falls on this land in green flows to the Mekong River and down the Mekong River and out into the ocean. You can see all these dashed lines are dams, either existing or the black, under construction or red or planned or in the orange. And you can see here's the Chinese border, all these dams up the Mekong River. So that's doing two things. There's some in Laos as well. Not many in Thailand. There's a couple in Thailand, a few, and then down through Cambodia there's a few as well. So what does that do? A couple things. One is it destroys the ecosystem and the environment. When you take a river ecosystem and you change it to a stillwater lake ecosystem, it just wrecks the aquatic ecosystem in these areas. So that's one thing. So the fishing and all that's going to be worse. The other thing it does, and we see that this in the United States at the Colorado River, is the more water you impound up here and use up here, the less water is eventually going to flow all the way down here to the Delta. In the instance of the Colorado River in the American West, they use so much of that water. I mean, the Colorado is a major river. That's what carved the Grand Canyon. You've seen videos of rafting trips and all that in the Grand Canyon. By the time it reaches the Pacific Ocean, it's a trickle because they're taking so much of that water and piping it to other areas like California and Las Vegas and all those areas. As that river flows, rivers naturally get bigger as they flow down current because they're picking up more water from tributaries as they go along. But in the case of major rivers, and you have major populations, and especially like the western United States, it's really dry, that river is actually losing water as it flows because people are siphoning it off. And that's what China is doing up here. Now, luckily, this region is pretty damp anyway. It has plenty of rainfall, but still, they're going to greatly affect the flow of that river all the way down to the Delta. So that's something to keep in mind, and there's been actually wars for it over stuff, not on this river, but in other parts of the world. People have had wars over water rights. So that's something to keep an eye on there maybe in the future. As the population continues to grow, how are they going to deal with these type of issues? So you see a lot of ground subsidence and stuff like that. There's a lot of rice grown in this entire area, especially down here at the Delta. So you see a lot of the ground subsidence. We've mentioned that a couple times in this semester as well. I'm talking about population geography. You see here, we've seen these maps in every realm. You see where the populations are, the darker areas is where the highest density of population is. You see this island down here. This is Java. This is Indonesian, and that's by far the population center of Indonesia. And it has over half the country's population just on this one island. Again, remember, all these islands are Indonesia, and most of the people live on this one island right here. It has plenty of water, of volcanic soils, a lot of rice grown there as well. And again, I mentioned this earlier, Indonesia is the fourth largest country by population in the world. So we've already studied East Asia and South Asia, and we have all those people there, and here we have in Southeast Asia the fourth largest country in the world. So that entire area over there has a lot of people. So this area, you see here, it says kind of a historic crossroads of religions. That's been very dynamic over its history. You had Hinduism and Buddhism from South Asia in the India area have moved into the western part of this region, especially Burma or Myanmar here. That's this country right here that kind of runs down this coast. It's kind of elongated down the coast. You have Islam coming in from Southwest Asia, from the Arabian area. And Islam is the fastest growing population in the region today. It's growing faster than any other religion in the region, and they're starting to have some problems over this. The Muslim minorities are actually starting to clash with some of the governments in these countries and kind of destabilizing things a little bit. Because as you know, the Muslim faith sometimes is a little bit more strict than some other faiths, especially when it's exported to other countries. It tends to be a little bit more strict than it might be in some more developed countries that have had Islam for a long time. So it just depends on what sect it is. But generally speaking, when it spreads like that, you're going to have the more aggressive, the more conservative types of that religion trying to get a foothold in these countries. Buddhism is still popular in a good part of this realm, especially in these countries, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. And remember, Myanmar and Burma are the same countries. It was historically called Burma. Relatively recently, the last 15, 20 years, they changed the name to Myanmar. Myanmar is a very unstable country even today. It's had its issues for the last several decades. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei are the three big Muslim countries right now. And of course, Indonesia has the huge population, so of course, it's the largest Muslim country population-wise outside of Southwest Asia, the core of the Muslim faith. Angkor Wat is in Cambodia. There is the Google Earth exercise and your homework for this on Angkor Wat. So it was originally built as a Hindu temple, but later became a Buddhist temple. And then Vietnam kind of is a melting pot of all these religions. Several different religions kind of come together there, and some people kind of practice one, kind of practice the other. So it's pretty open with regards to religion. So here, this map is showing you ethnicities in Southeast Asia. And one thing I want to point out here, of course, there's some that you've never heard the names of before, and that's perfectly fine. And then you see like the Thai population, which is natural up in this area. You have Indonesian down here, of course. But pay attention to the purple, the Chinese. So China's up here. They didn't. It's not in this realm, so they didn't color it purple. But in this realm, you see a lot of purple dots on all these islands. You see purple, purple, purple. These are typically around large cities on these islands and in these countries up here, and it's due to Chinese immigration. And the immigration is sufficient enough that the predominant minority in these areas are Chinese. So that's something that's going to be a theme throughout this entire lecture is the Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. It's been there for a long time, but it's been like on steroids the last 20 years. They really are expanding out. If you remember in our last lesson on East Asia, I talked about how China is a superpower now in the world in every aspect, militarily, economically, and they're contending to try to get more power and more resources. And Southeast Asia is one of these places that they are really, really entering into more and more each day. And, you know, sometimes you could say that's good for business, but some of these countries are really nervous about China and their plans for the future. So here, this is just keeps talking about some of the immigrants that come to this area. South Asians, which would be Indians or Bangladesh, primarily Indians though. These are the areas that they kind of come into. The Malay Peninsula, which is right here, and actually contains three different countries on the Malay Peninsula. You've got Malaysia, which is the southern end of this, and then part of Borneo here. Thailand has a narrow strip down through here, actually widens right here in the whole peninsula, and then this strip up here, this elongated strip, is Burma or Myanmar. So such a thin piece of land actually has a lot of different countries and activity on it. And again, here's the statement: there's growing tension between national governments and Muslim minorities. We've seen that trend grow. Probably 10, 15 years ago, we actually heard about some tourist areas in Indonesia and Malaysia having some issues with some groups kind of taking tourists hostage and stuff like that. So those type of things, I haven't heard of that much recently. I think it's stabilized a little bit, but that was kind of a thing for a while there. Now in Myanmar or Burma up here, um, I mentioned before, this country has always been, at least since I've been studying it or know about it, it's always been unstable. There's always ethnic clashes there. The government has committed atrocities against some of the the cultural groups in the area. The Muslim minority is one of those. Um, at that time, the Buddhists were in charge, and they perpetrated that violence, and it's just a mess. That's the best way I can put it. It's actually flared back up quite a bit here in the last couple of months. I've been seeing it on the news more and more. So I don't get into the details of it a lot. I don't know a lot about the person that's in charge or anything like that right now. But it has been an issue. Now, there have been some times that you'll see reports that China's investing in it, India's investing in it, and they're trying to update a port, stuff like that, and make some infrastructure better. But it seems like they keep slipping back into the same old routine over and over again. So this is a map kind of showing the Chinese influence as it spread through this is the South China Sea right here, and how it's kind of gone out, and you see these kind of purplish areas, major concentrations, secondary concentrations of Chinese nationals. So you see it's been pretty significant, and again, it's happened throughout history, but especially the past 20 years or so. You're really seeing this ramp over probably 30 years now. And sometimes these Chinese minorities kind of don't agree with the local governments. Um, in Singapore, you see clashes between the old Chinese and the new Chinese. Now, what does that mean? Well, the old Chinese might be the ones that are sort of with Taiwan. Remember, we talked about Taiwan and how they were the people that lost the Civil War there back in the day actually went to Taiwan and established their own government there. And the new Chinese would be the ones that now side with China, mainland China. So you have even issues between the same cultural people, but whose faith that they're with, who they believe in with regards to who the real China is. Now, Chinese really wants to be friends with Singapore. Now, Singapore is right here, and we're going to talk about that more in detail later. Singapore is a country, it's kind of a city-state. It's really only a city, but it is one of the Asian tigers. Remember the Asian tiger cities that we mentioned? Taiwan is actually an island, but it's also a city that are really strong in the economic sector. The other three were in East Asia. This is the one, Singapore, is in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they're kind of on the way up a little bit. Vietnam, even though we had a war there, and technically we kind of lost that war, we left without really gaining anything in that war. That was a relic of the Cold War that we had with the Soviet Union that we've talked about in detail in this course. Today we have a pretty close relationship with Vietnam, the country. They were once our enemy, and now we're pretty friendly with them. Indonesia and Malaysia, we're okay with most of those countries. They're not strong allies, but no problems with them either. But all these countries have attracted a lot of foreign investment, and they've really been growing economically in recent years. And just like any place in the world, you're going to have your prosperous areas and your poor areas. So some of these countries are really poor as well, like Myanmar, Burma. It's one of the poorest countries in the entire world. So here's a little bit more on Singapore. I'll let you kind of read some of this in your textbook, the seaport. These are some of the trade organizations that they have in Southeast Asia. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them right here. You can read about these in your textbook as well, just for time's sake right now. So again, we're going to go back to this. We mentioned this the last two realms, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So there's the road on the Asian continent, The belt would also be rail infrastructure and sea traffic. So China is reaching out to these countries trying to invest in infrastructure for these countries, like a high-speed rail network or money to better their ports so that their ships can go there. And again, I emphasized this last time, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart because they feel sorry for these countries. They need more resources for their population. So they're reaching out and trying to establish connections with these countries, and they hope to be allies with them and have them kind of on their side with regards to the United States. That's one of the big goals here. Now, Southeast Asia, this realm is growing faster than any other developing realm. So what we used to call third world realms, but China is the biggest investor there so far. And again, China is kind of creating a little bit of anxiety with some of these countries because they're so prominent in the area and so close as well. So let's take a step back a little bit. So back in the colonial days, we're talking back in the 1800s or so, going into the early 1900s in some cases, you had your European colonialism. And this is a map of that. And you see the French sphere. So you had the French were in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. And if you know your history very well, if you're a history geek, you'll know that Vietnam ran the French out and defeated them militarily just before we went over there for the Vietnam War. So the French had their colonization here. Now you'll see the British had Myanmar and some in Thailand and this area, Malaysia, this area down here. The Spanish had the Philippines. Now, we're going to talk about the Philippines here in just a little while, but the Spanish had it first, and then we had the Spanish-American War in 1898, and we gained control of the Philippines through that war. So we actually controlled the Philippines up until around World War II. I think the date's on the slide, one of the slides coming up. So in the Philippines, you're going to have a lot of ties to the United States, and you're going to have a lot of place names over there, and even people, you'll hear names that sound Latino because the Spanish were there for a while. So Spanish was a language that a lot of people learned while it was a Spanish colony. And then the Dutch actually had a lot of area down here. We haven't talked about the Dutch a lot with regards to colonialism, but they had a lot of these islands down here. And again, a lot of this was due to the spice trade back in those days. And just like anything else, any other colonization, they kind of pitted local cultures and countries against each other, and there was a lot of infighting, and the same rinse and repeat what they did in the Americas and Africa, parts of Asia, and now mainland Asia, and now Southeast Asia. So kind of the same deal as you've seen in other places. Again, that term Indochina was what the French called this, so that's not really a correct term nowadays, but it was just because the proximity between China and India. Let's see. Again, here's your British colonies. Nothing new I haven't mentioned on this. Spice Islands, I've mentioned this numerous times about the island, the spices in the island areas down there. And here is the information I just gave you on the Philippines. They're controlled by Spain since 1571, and then we took over in 1898, and until 1946, they were actually a colony of the United States. Very heavy fighting in World War II between Japan and the United States on the Philippines. So I mentioned this already too, the Cold War. You remember that back from our previous lessons, the kind of proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. The containment strategy was something the U.S. wanted to kind of box in the Soviets and not allow them to take over new territory anywhere in the world. And Vietnam in those days was a communist government, and it was a proxy of the Soviet Union. So that's why we went in there and fought in Vietnam, basically. We were trying to fight on the side of the Vietnamese. Vietnam was actually split, kind of like Korea was, and we were trying to support the capitalist part of the government versus the communist part the Soviets supported. So, let me see. That war ended in 1975, so it was going on after I was born, actually, but I don't really remember anything. I was way too young then. But I did know a lot of people, older people, that fought in that war. Very, very violent and horrific war. Pretty rough. Let's see. So here, this slide is talking about the different types of countries, the way they're configured, and pretty much this is a unique realm because it kind of supports all the different types of countries. You have a compact country, which is pretty regular shape. All the country has it's kind of, it's not just a square or anything. However, it's a compact country and it's all kind of together. You have a fragmented country like the Philippines, all these islands. So there's actually ocean between these islands. Fragmented could also be on one piece of land. You might have a country split up by different sections of another country, for instance. Protruded means that you have kind of a compact country and part of it, but then you have a piece of it that kind of protrudes out from the main body. And then you have elongated, like long from north to south, but thin from east to west. So, and these are just the example of the definitions of each one of these over here. So perforated, they don't show that on the map. Perforated means that they kind of have a hole in the middle. So there's another country in the middle of a bigger country. So they're totally surrounded by a country. Lesotho in South Africa is one that jumps to mind right now. That would be a perforated state. So here is something that we're going to talk about a little bit here. Make sure you pay attention to this if you're watching this lecture video, because it is one of the questions on your test, one of the essay questions. And this has to do with the South China Sea. So in the last lesson on East Asia, we talked about China and Taiwan and how they're at odds. China wants to take Taiwan over. That's a big deal right now because they've been kind of posturing and threatening Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan is the United States' ally. So we've been basically saying, if you invade Taiwan, we're coming in hot and we're going to defend Taiwan. So that's a big point of contention. So your essay question, I'm going to ask you to describe either that relationship and what's going on there, or what's happening in the South China Sea. So what's happening in the South China Sea, you see all these lines on this map. What you need to do is look at the legend down here and figure out what each of these lines mean. So we've already studied in previous chapters, I can't remember which realm that was in, if that was in the Pacific realm, I think it was in the Pacific realm, that we talked about the maritime rules with regards to the rights of a boundary that go out into the sea. Whose territory is what? So historically, Vietnam claimed the blue line around here, and then you had Philippines has the green line here, and then you have Malaysia with the yellow lines here, and then you have China. So used to, China would claim this area up here, but at some point, I don't remember exactly when they did this. It doesn't say in here the year. They started claiming this red dashed line here. Basically, all of the South China Sea, they're claiming is their territory. Now, even the territory claimed by Vietnam here, with maritime law, that does not apply. There's only a short distance off the coast that is truly Vietnam territory, and all this out here is actually open water, which means any country can sail or traverse this water. What these lines represent is claiming the resources on the sea floor, basically. So if there's oil reserves, if there's some kind of resource that is good, that is what they're claiming. So China's come in and kind of drawn this red dash line and says this is ours, and we're going to enforce this. So you can see all the countries they're at odds with: Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and further north of here with Japan, in East Asia. So this has kind of been a hot topic in the last decade or so. They've begun to start trying to enforce this. Of course, Philippines is one of the staunchest opponents to this, and they kind of stood off with China on a few of their islands out here. Vietnam is no fan of this either, and they've kind of stood off with them. Malaysia doesn't like it, but they're not quite as powerful as Vietnam or Philippines, so they haven't really said a whole lot. But there's a lot going on in this area, and China's kind of flexing its muscle. Now, every now and then on the news, you're going to hear a news story saying that the Chinese warned an American ship, because we still say this is open maritime water. We're sailing through it. We have the right to, and we're going to do it anyway. And we'll go through there, and inevitably we'll get close to one of these islands out here, and they'll warn us off saying, hey, you got to leave or we're going to fire on you. And it's all a lot of talk. I don't think anybody's actually going to fire on each other. Not anytime soon anyway here, but you'll hear about that every now and then happening out here, even though we continue to sail these waters just like it's never happened. So that's just kind of what our militaries do. We kind of test each other all the time. Another thing that's going on out here is in a lot of these areas, they're actually building islands. And you might say, how are they building an island? Well, it's just what you think. So, first of all, there are a lot of shallow areas and reefs in this area, okay? So you have some little islands up here, you might have a reef up here, and as you know, reefs are pretty shallow. So you might be talking about, 8 or 10 feet of water is all the depth that you have on some of these reefs. So China has actually started dredging sand off the bottom and other parts and actually piling it up there and building islands. Actually bringing in sediment and sand and making islands tall enough to stick out of the water. They're putting airstrips on those islands. It's a pretty big deal, and they've built several of these, and some of them are pretty sizable. Now, I assume they have good engineers there. I assume they'll hold up. I don't know. I wouldn't want to land a plane on one of them, but I'm sure they're functioning fine. One problem is climate change. If sea level keeps rising, they're going to have to keep building them taller and taller, because if you just get 4 or 5 feet over sea level, that's probably going to be inundated in 15, 20, 30 years, whatever it's going to take. So they're going to have to keep doing it. I did want to kind of jump out of this for a second and go to Google Earth. And I wanted to show you, first of all, just look at the realm here. Basically, all this and all this. You see it's all almost green. You see a little bit of rain shell effect right here in Burma or Myanmar. But everything else is pretty green. So you got rainforest. So I put in a coordinate. And I thought this was interesting. You see this little dot right here. First of all, when you look at the ocean here, you see these little ripples in here. And, of course, the lighter water is shallower, right? So this is the South China Sea. They're building islands up in this area, some all down through here. So I put in a coordinate I found online to one of these islands that they're building. Because if any of you are curious, you might say, well, I want to see one of these islands. So I wanted to show you one. So we're going to zoom in here real quick. And you're going to see something happen. As you get closer to this, it looks like an island. Kinda, sorta. Not really. Because you can see it's kind of dark. As you get closer and closer, look at the pixelation changes. And you can kind of see some shallow spots here, but you can see this is definitely out of place. These pixels, these pictures, these images. This should be here, this should be here, this should be here, but all of this has been pixelated so we can't see it. So that probably It was done by Google at the request of the U.S. Defense Forces because of security reasons. They can do that, and they have taken those images off here, so we can't monitor that. So this looks like it's actually an island. It's a shallow area that's actually sticking up just a tad bit right there. There's just a shallow area. So a shallow area like this that's not very deep, this is where they would start building an island, something like that. They've done it up here, but they've pixelated this all out. So I just thought that was interesting when I kind of zoomed into it, that they're actually kind of hiding this on Google Earth. I'd say they wouldn't do it for China. They're doing it probably United States defense folks said, hey, we don't want people looking at these. So that just kind of shows you there's plenty of kind of options up here. Look at how shallow all this water is out here, and all these little ridges out here. So that I just thought that was kind of interesting when I looked at it. But again, this is the realm right here. Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam up here, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar up here, and East Timor down here. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. And this is just kind of mentioning some of those island chains that I was mentioning. These are the ones that are kind of contested between all these countries, really. All these countries say that they claim parts of these islands as their own. So now hybrid warfare is something they mention here. So what is this? That's a mix of tactics to get your objectives without actually fighting militarily. So trade wars, like I said, kind of challenging each other, kind of a stare down, like, hey, you're not going to do anything, we're just going to take it kind of thing. Oh. And here it shows that in 2015, that's when they first confirmed that they were actually building these islands. And basically, like I said before, some of these countries have an opinion about it, but nobody's really done a lot about it. The Philippines is the one that I've seen that has kind of stood up to China the most and had a standoff or two on a couple of these islands. They had military personnel there saying, we're not going to give this up, and China was out there threatening them that they were going to attack, but they didn't. So, by and large, though, China's kind of getting what they want. And they pretty much control this area as far as militarily. Again, maritime traffic still goes through here. The U.S. routinely sails our ships through here, even though China threatens us. They don't ever do anything. But they've kind of backed down these countries in the region a little bit. Here, the regions, we basically have two regions here. We have the mainland, which is this peninsula up here. I've already gone through the countries here. And then you have the insular region, which means the island region. That's what insular pretty much means, the island region of the realm. And here's just a bigger map of that. You see the cities, the bigger the dot, the bigger the population. And you can see some of the bigger cities. Manila in the Philippines is huge. Jakarta in Indonesia is huge. You see Singapore here, which Singapore is a giant with regards to economy and all that stuff. But as far as the size of it goes, it's not as big as some of these mega cities up here, but it is substantial with regards to trade and all that. And I've already talked about much of this. It has some really big cities, but the cities on the population on the mainland are rural as well. There are more people in cities than in rural areas, but there are people in the rural areas as well. Versus on the islands, it's predominantly urban population clusters, except for Jakarta. Jakarta has pretty much a density everywhere on the island. And I've already talked about Vietnam a little bit. A lot of agriculture in Vietnam. They sit on the coast there, so they have a lot of coastal plains. I mentioned they grow a lot of rice, but they also grow coffee, tea, and rubber. Grow some cotton as well, spices. I think most of these countries grow a lot of spices. Let's see, Cambodia. I'm like previous chapters, I'm not going to go through these in detail because you've got most of this in your textbook. I will mention Cambodia had a huge genocide. There have been several movies made about it in 1970 and 1976, so that coincided with the last part of the Vietnam War. The Khmer Rouge was the ruling party there. Pol Pot was the leader of that party. I don't know if he's called president or what he was called actually. But they had a split in the country, a cultural split, and about 2 million Cambodians were killed through a genocide. And they actually forced people to move out of the cities into the rural areas because they wanted more agriculture. They wanted to grow their own food and stuff like that. So recently they've gotten back on track a little bit better, and you can see kind of what they're in here. They make a lot of clothing, and there's some oil there, and they have some oil resources. Laos is probably one of the poorer states. It doesn't have good infrastructure. It's landlocked, so it doesn't have access to the ocean. And the countries surrounding it are just much more powerful and much more advanced than they are. Only 1/3 of the population lives in cities, so it's a rural country there. And it's been pretty slow to open up its economy. And the Vietnam War, of course, Vietnam was over here, the elongated state here, but there was a lot of fighting in Laos as well. It crossed over the border quite a bit, and there was some fighting there as well. Thailand, most of you probably heard of Thailand. It's one of the more popular countries in this region to travel to. A lot of people like to go to Thailand. You've got Bangkok is the principal city there, a mega city. It has the slowest rate of population growth in the realm, but it does have a pretty thriving tourist industry there. And Bangkok is the largest city on the mainland part of South Asia. And its economic progress, this is kind of a mixed bag because they do have a lot of tourism, but they have had some political instability as well, so that has kind of stymied some of the growth as far as typical manufacturing and stuff like that goes. There are travel advisories at times for parts of Thailand, but still, they do still get a whole lot of tourism there in that country. And again, you have a kind of an elongated part of it that goes down the protrusion, they call it, goes down this peninsula, very thin right here next to Myanmar, spreads out here, and then it touches Malaysia down here at the southern tip of it. So most of the southern population in this are Muslims. Again, this is a country that has a big Muslim population for Southeast Asia. And they're having, you see here at the bottom, this kind of mirrors what I said earlier in the lesson, that they are having more Islamic militants and violence. And that's what I was talking about with the hostage situations that occurred 10, 15 years ago. The older I get, I have more trouble remembering exactly how long ago something was, so I think it was around 10 or 15 years ago. Now, Myanmar, I've mentioned this several times, also called Burma, probably the poorest country in the realm, one of the poorest in the country or the entire world. They have a brutal military dictatorship. I've already mentioned there's always something going on there with regards to human rights and all that. So China is trying to influence there. They're pumping money into there like they are everywhere else. But they have a long way to go in Myanmar before they get anything going. A lot of illicit drugs grown in this area. Opium is the primary one. Looks like they produce some methamphetamine as well. They're kind of like Bangladesh. Remember we talked about Bangladesh and rising sea levels and the storms that hit there and caused the flooding. Of course, Myanmar is right here next to it, so they experience similar issues there. Remember I pointed out that was the only kind of dry spot in the whole realm was right here. It's because you have a rain shadow effect from the mountains over here. And their monsoon season has been getting shorter as well, so you don't have those soaking rains up in this area that you might have. the weird thing about climate change is it seems like we're talking about monsoons, typhoons, hurricanes. They're all the same thing, just different parts of the world. It seems like the seasons are about the same or a little bit shorter. The frequency is more hit or miss, but we're having more big, powerful storms at one time. So when you don't have them as regularly as you used to, some of these countries depend on that rainfall in some of these areas, and sometimes they just don't get it when they need it. So most of the country is subsistence farming, which means they're just growing food for themselves, their families to eat. And let's see. This is talking about Myanmar's new opportunities from China. Again, I've seen on the news recently they're going back into their violent normal, I guess you would call it. So even though it says here they're having some more new opportunities, I think they're sliding backwards a little bit as we speak right now. And now you have the insular, the island countries, and you have some of these listed here. Again, Singapore is a city-state. It's basically just a city. East Timor is a mini-state, very small country. I'm just kind of reading this, see what I want to mention on here. So I'm not going to go into great detail on some of these countries. You can read about this in your textbook. Brunei, very small country located on Borneo. Remember, Borneo is the island, and Brunei is a small country up here on the northern edge of it. Singapore. Now, one thing I wanted to point out about Singapore. So when you just look at a bigger map, let's go back a slide. So Singapore is right here on the end of this island here. So you got Singapore sitting here on the end. It looks like it's on the mainland there, on the main part. But if you look closer on the tip of Malaysia here, the peninsula, it's actually separated by water. So it's actually a very small island that's very close to the Malaysian peninsula here. So it is an island. It doesn't sit way out in the ocean like some of these islands do. It's right here next to it. It's almost like the width of a river between it, but it is an island. The entire island is basically a city, and it's called a city-state. So it's its own country. It's kind of a standalone. And you can see here it's seceded from Malaysia in 1965 to create its own little country. And here you have the ethnic makeup of that. So 75% of Singapore is Chinese culture. And it talks about here the growth, the economy, the manufacturing. It was one of the original Asian tigers that I mentioned earlier that we talked about in the East Asian lesson. And we've already mentioned most of this. I've already mentioned this down here, but just call it out again. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. 88% of its population is Muslim. Let me see. A lot of transmigration, which means they had a policy to relocate a lot of people from like bigger cities to the islands to try to disperse the population more evenly. Typically, people have a decline in the standard of living once that's done. You have cultural conflicts because you've got a lot of new people coming into the natives areas, and they really don't like that. You have deforestation. Now, they canceled that program in 2001. And since 2000, they have really expanded their economy. Java, again, is the largest and most, or not the largest in land area, but the largest in population. It has the highest population density. Sumatra is the island just to the northwest of Java. They had the tsunami there that I mentioned earlier. That's what I told you. If you're interested, look up a video on YouTube. It's pretty impressive when you see it. And Indonesia stretches from Sumatra all the way to Papua And Papua New Guinea is actually a country on the east side of this island. The west side part of it is part of Indonesia called Papua. East Timor is a tiny nation down here. See, it's on the northern coast of Java, and it has a pretty good population for its size. The Philippines is again a bunch of islands. Used to be a U.S. colony, used to be a Spanish colony. A lot of multicultural, a lot of different ethnicities moved to the Philippines. A lot of people know English in the country. Some people, again, know Spanish there. It's mostly Christian country, so that's one thing that kind of stands out with Philippines versus all the other countries in this realm. One thing I found interesting, remittances. So what is a remittance? A remittance is when people from a country move to other countries for jobs and they make money, but then they send that money back to their families in their home country. That's where a remittance is. So about 10% of all the money that came into the Philippines was remittances from family working abroad and sending their money back to their families inside the country. Now the Philippines too, a little current event on this. So they've had some different rulers, some different governments over the years. They've kind of been unstable a little bit, not like a lot of violence, not too much, but they've had some swaying in their foreign policy. U.S. used to have military bases there up and through the 1990s. At that time, their president that came in was not too friendly with the United States, so they terminated some of those leases, so we left. And we went through a few more leaders, some not so close to the United States. Now they want to be close to us again because of the threat from China. So they're wanting to be closer to us than they have been in the last several years. So that's kind of an interesting development. And that's it for this lesson. So that's going to be all the lessons for the semester. Before the final comes out, I will update you on what's going to be on it. I'll probably have a little study guide to show you what you need to be thinking about and what you need to study for. And I'll send out a message. I'm going to put your last test up probably early Monday morning. And I will let you know what the essay test questions are going to be, although I think I've already told you in this lesson. Be sure to think about China with Taiwan and the South China Sea. So as always, if you need anything, just let me know. Thank you.